are we going to buy it from? Given that the rich nations produce by far the majority of the world's carbon emissions, so in other words, there are fewer carbon emissions to be bought from the poor nations than there are carbon emissions being produced by the rich nations, given that those poor nations also have to make their own cuts, the only possible source of the carbon indulgences which this government needs to buy in order to meet its 60% cut by 2050 is Mars and Jupiter. And plainly, there is some policy wonk in the Cabinet Office at the moment working out how such a trading scheme could take place. Because you simply cannot buy the credits on this planet. They do not exist. There aren't enough of them. The only way we can tackle this problem is to cut carbon emissions right now and right here. So how? How on earth do we start to devise a system which is in any way concomitant with the scale of the challenge we now plainly face? Well, in my view, there's an absolute moral, technical, political and economic imperative, which is that we start with the system first proposed by Mayor Hillman, sitting here in the front row of the audience, of carbon rationing. This is the only fair way, it is the only politically viable way, it is the only way which is simple enough, it is the only way that's going to work. Because what it does is to put an absolute cap on the country's carbon emissions and allocate those fairly amongst the people of the country. Completely the opposite. Completely the opposite, by the way, to the European emissions trading system, which is a classical act of enclosure, handing over the carbon rights that the whole country owns to a group of corporations. And not just any old group of corporations, the very corporations who have been most responsible for carbon pollution in the past. The polluter has been paid. What carbon rationing does is to allocate it fairly and do so in line with the science. But this, of course, has to be supplemented by a whole series of measures. And what I'm going to talk about might sound a bit like techno-fixes and technocratic fantasies and all the rest of it, but unfortunately we're going to have to make some bold economic and political leaps, and in some cases we're going to have to rely heavily on new technologies in order to make this cut. So bear with me, and bear in mind all the time that accompanying these crazy-sounding but entirely feasible solutions, which I'm going to mention fairly briefly, accompanying these has got to be a massive drive towards energy efficiency, energy reduction, energy descent, to accompany the carbon rationing system and the thing that I'm just about to talk about. I'm going to draw on work published by the German government, by Mark Barrett at University College London, and by the Centre for Alternative Technology in Machynlleth, all of which have done some very interesting, groundbreaking work on how we could decarbonise the entire economy between, in the German government's study, 80%, Mark Barrett's study 95%, the Centre for Alternative Technology study 100%. And still be able to sustain a politically viable economy. In other words, one which isn't going to get people coming out on the streets in the modern equivalent of bread riots because they can't do the things like watching television which they want to be able to do. We have to be able to keep energy flowing through the system, or it's not going to be politically viable. And the key word here is electricity, because this is the only means by which we can decarbonise energy systems and keep as much of the show on the road as has to be kept on the road without triggering off these great counter-austerity riots, which are what, well, the fuel protests were just one little glimmer of what might one day come. Now, many environmentalists, possibly even most environmentalists, take a position here which, unfortunately, I've come to believe is wrong. And this is to say that we must generate renewable electricity on a very, very large scale by means of microgeneration and local grid networks. Now, it's a very appealing idea. It's great. Small is beautiful. No great massive pylons racing across the countryside. We can take down all the transmission grids. It sounds really nice. But there are a couple of problems. And Well, the first one, the overwhelming one, is this, that people have chosen to live where there's very little ambient energy. We've chosen not to live on top of mountains, we've chosen not to live in deserts, we've chosen not to live several hundred miles off the coast. I can't think why not. Because there is so much ambient energy there. It's not very nice where there's lots of ambient energy, we try to avoid it. And so the places we've chosen to live in don't have very much of it. Average wind speeds in a city like this, 4 miles per hour. That's not even the cut-in speed of some of the micro wind generators which are on the market at the moment. At the same time, you've got this problem, a particular problem with microgeneration of intermittency. If you are drawing largely from a small area, your electricity supplies, if the wind drops and the sun goes in that small area, it's gone everywhere as far as your grid is concerned. And you're much more subject to the problem of intermittency on a small scale than you are on a large scale. So I'm going to tear up much of my environmental training and say in this particular case, big is beautiful. And what we need to do is to start looking at all the best, the richest sources of non-carbon ambient energy and start tapping into them. I'm talking about very large-scale wind farms a very long way offshore, where the only people whose aesthetic sensibilities are going to be challenged are trawlermen. Well, I don't care very much about trawlermen. I'm talking about tapping into an incredibly rich source just to the south of Europe, called the Sahara Desert, which not only has a huge amount of solar radiation and very little cloud cover, so it's pretty damn reliable, but also, wonderfully, goes from east to west, which means that when the sun's going down at one end, it's almost coming up at the other end. You get about 15 hours of solid power a day if you were to have major solar farms striding across the Sahara Desert. I'm talking about making use of energy resources which already exist and which can help to stabilise the rest of the grid. So, for example, the hydroelectric power in the Alps and in Scandinavia. The German study even talks about a submarine cable going all the way to Iceland in order to tap into the geothermal power there. Now, none of this in previous studies has appeared possible for one simple reason. And the simple reason is this, that people were using, in their theorising at any rate, the wrong kind of transmission technology. And it seems to me that the key environmental technology is not actually an energy generating technology, it is an energy transmission technology. It is in fact the high voltage direct current cable. And the great thing about direct current cables is that they lose very little electricity in transmission, so they can travel for a very, very long distance. There's already one in the undemocratic non-republic of the Congo, which is 1,800 kilometres long. The maximum technical feasible length is about 4,500 kilometres. Now this means that you can spread your sources as widely as possible, so that if the wind drops off the Atlantic coast, it's likely still to be blowing in the North Sea. If the sun's gone in the Sahara, you can tap into other sources around this European grid, which I believe we have to build. Another good aspect of high voltage DC is that it takes up much less land and it's much less ugly than those hideous pylons which carry the AC lines, and it's much cheaper over a long distance than they are as well. And it's for historical reasons and historical accident, really, that we use AC as our means of transmission. It's no longer necessary to do so. Now, what the German study shows, and linking that up with some of the energy storage technologies, which both Mark Barrett and the Centre for Alternative Technology have tapped into, is that by this means you can have an entirely stable grid based on largely variable renewable power. And this is the